As a single mother living in the heart of the city, finding reliable help for even the simplest household repairs is always a challenge. It's just me and my daughter, and with my busy life, I don't always have time to wait around for hours or haggle over prices. So I've come to rely on a trusted companion, Google, to help me track down technicians nearby whenever something breaks. It's become a familiar routine. Something goes wrong, I type a few keywords into the search bar, and I cross my fingers hoping for a capable and honest handyman. This time, it was the chandelier in the living room causing trouble again. The bulb had blown, second time in 1 week. It flickered out the same way it had the last time, just days after I'd replaced it. I stared up at it with a frustrated sigh, knowing it was more than just a faulty bulb. There had to be an underlying issue with the electrical wiring. The thought of an electrical fire crossed my mind, and I felt a chill sweep over me. I needed a professional to sort this out, someone who knew more about circuits than I ever would. So I did my usual. A quick search for electrician near me, and within minutes, I was on the phone with a man whose voice crackled through the line with a rough but reassuring tone. He sounded older, the kind of voice that carries the weight of years. "Don't worry, ma'am," he said, his words thick with a regional accent that hinted at long days spent in the sun. "If I can't make it myself, I'll send my son over. He's just as good as me, maybe better. He'll be there around for PM. If that's all right." "That's perfect," I replied, feeling a wave of relief. It was only noon, so I had a few hours to myself before anyone showed up. I hung up the phone and glanced around my quiet house. My daughter was at her father's place for the weekend, leaving me with an unusual emptiness that was both freeing and unsettling. It felt like I had too much time to myself, and I wasn't quite sure what to do with it. I decided to indulge in a little self-care. I ran a warm bath, letting the steam rise around me as I sank into the water, the scent of lavender filling the air. I lingered longer than I normally would, soaking in the silence of the empty house. Once out, I slipped into a loose satin nightgown that draped over my body like a whisper. It was thin enough to be comfortable and breezy, but just thick enough to leave some things to the imagination. Usually I would have put on something more substantial, but with nobody around, it seemed just fine. Besides, it was just an electrician coming by later. I'd change before he arrived, I told myself. The hours drifted by, and soon enough, the doorbell rang. I glanced at the clock. It was only 12:30. Puzzled, I walked toward the door, my bare feet making soft thuds against the wooden floor. Maybe it was a delivery, or one of the neighbors. As I opened the door, I was greeted by the sight of a young man, well-built and casually dressed, standing on my doorstep. His t-shirt clung to his chest, hinting at the muscles underneath, and his jeans hung low on his hips in a way that made him look effortlessly handsome. His face was smooth and youthful, with just the faintest trace of stubble across his jaw. "Good afternoon, ma'am," he said, his voice deep and steady. "I'm here for the electrical work. My father couldn't make it, so he sent me instead." For a moment, I was taken aback, my hand still gripping the edge of the door as I stared at him. This was the electrician. The man I spoke to on the phone had sounded at least twice this young man's age, with a voice that crackled like dry leaves, full of years and wisdom. I had pictured someone older, grizzled and weathered, with silver hair and a beard streaked with white, perhaps wearing a tool belt and worn-out overalls that had seen better days. Instead, I found myself facing a man who looked like he had just stepped out of a fitness magazine. He was tall, his frame solid and well-built, with broad shoulders that stretched the fabric of his plain t-shirt in all the right places. His skin was sun-kissed, the kind of deep, warm tan that suggested hours spent working outdoors, and his dark hair was thick and slightly tousled, as though he had run his fingers through it just before ringing the doorbell. His jawline was chiseled, with a faint shadow of stubble that added a rugged edge to his otherwise youthful appearance. And his eyes, oh, those eyes were a rich, dark brown, glinting with a mixture of curiosity and amusement as he noticed the surprise on my face. I realized I had been staring a beat too long, my thoughts spinning in an unexpected direction. He was nothing like the image I had conjured up in my mind. There was no graying hair or deep lines etched into his skin from decades of labor. Instead, this man was like an Adonis standing before me, with muscles that hinted at strength and hands that looked capable of much more than just fixing electrical problems. "All right, The chandelier, I stammered, snapping myself out of my daze and clearing my throat. I felt a flush creep up my neck, embarrassed that I had let my thoughts wander so far off course. I stepped back, opening the door wider. "Come in, please." As he crossed the threshold, the space seemed to fill with his presence, the air thickening just slightly. I noticed the subtle scent of his cologne, something earthy and clean, mingling with the faint trace of sweat that clung to his skin, as if he had just finished another job before coming here. His movements were fluid, almost effortless, as he walked inside, and I couldn't help but watch the way his muscles moved beneath the fabric of his shirt. There was a confidence in the way he carried himself, as if he was used to being noticed, but also a hint of shyness in the way his gaze flicked away from mine. I closed the door behind him, the soft click of the latch echoing in the quiet room. It felt as though I had just let in more than an electrician. There was an unspoken energy in the air, a sense that this visit might be more than just a routine house call. As he stepped into the house, his presence seemed to fill the room, and I couldn't help but notice how out of place my loose nightgown suddenly felt. It was as though I had been caught off guard, vulnerable in my own space. But instead of rushing off to change into something more covering, I decided I was perfectly fine the way I was, maybe even more than fine. He set down his tool bag and glanced up at the chandelier, squinting slightly as he took it in. "You said it's been blowing bulbs frequently?" he asked, pulling out a few tools and laying them out in a neat row. "Yes, this is the second one this week," I replied, folding my arms across my chest, feeling the smooth fabric of my nightgown brush against my skin. My heart thudded a little faster, each beat growing more pronounced as I watched him. There was a quiet tension in the room, the kind that sneaks up on you, making your pulse quicken without you quite knowing why. It wasn't just the situation. There was something else, something about him. He moved toward the stepladder with a steady confidence, the muscles in his shoulders and arms shifting under his t-shirt as he climbed up, each motion making the fabric stretch and pull against his body. I couldn't help but notice the way his biceps flexed as he reached up to inspect the chandelier, the taut lines of his forearms catching the light. His skin glistened faintly, a sheen of warmth that hinted at the heat outside. It seemed almost effortless for him, the way his strength showed in even the smallest of movements, and yet there was a grace to it too, a quiet poise that made it hard to look away. I tried to stay focused, to keep explaining the problem as he adjusted the light fixture, but the words started to blur together. My gaze kept drifting back to the way his arms moved, the subtle play of muscle beneath his skin, the veins that stood out just enough to catch my eye. The way his shirt hugged the curve of his back when he reached higher made something flutter in my chest, and I found myself pausing, my voice trailing off mid-sentence, as if the air had suddenly become too thick to speak through. He glanced down at me then, a quick, curious look, as though he could sense my distraction. I quickly cleared my throat, trying to pull my thoughts back to the flickering light above us, but I could still feel the heat rising in my cheeks, a warmth that seemed to spread across my skin, leaving me restless and aware of the silence hanging between us. "Sounds like a wiring issue," he said, glancing back down at me with a small, polite smile. I noticed a hint of shyness in his eyes, like he wasn't quite used to being stared at this way. "Do you enjoy what you do?" I asked, partly out of genuine curiosity and partly to keep him talking. There was a part of me that wanted to know more about him, as if learning the smallest details would somehow bring us closer. He chuckled softly, adjusting the fixture. "Yeah, I do," he said. "I've been working with my dad since I was a kid. It's kind of a family thing, you know." I found myself smiling at his answer. There was something charming about the way he spoke, like he was trying to maintain a professional tone even as his eyes kept darting back to me. I could see the faintest blush creeping up his neck whenever I moved a little closer. Normally, I would have excused myself to put on something more appropriate, but there was a thrill in knowing that the way I was dressed was making him nervous. As he worked, I kept finding reasons to chat with him. I asked about his hobbies, whether he planned on taking over the family business, and even teased him a little about the stubborn chandelier. He responded politely, but I could sense the tension in his voice, like he was trying not to let his thoughts wander too far from the task at hand. But I could also tell he was enjoying the attention. It was in the way his lips curled into a smile when he thought I wasn't looking, and in the way his eyes lingered on me just a little longer than they should have. After about 30 minutes, he climbed down from the ladder, his face flushed with a mix of exertion and something else. I think I found the issue, he said, wiping his hands on a rag. It was a loose connection. Should be good now. Oh, that's such a relief, I said, smiling warmly at him. Thank you. You've been a real lifesaver. I could see a flicker of pride in his expression as he packed up his tools. But I wasn't ready for him to leave just yet. Are you thirsty? Maybe I could get you something to drink, I offered. Or a quick snack. You know, to say thank you. He hesitated for a moment, glancing at his watch, then back at me. Well, I guess I could stay for a bit, he said with a small, nervous laugh. Great, I said, already heading to the kitchen. My mind raced as I threw together a small plate of snacks. I took a little extra time, just enough to keep him waiting without making it obvious. When I returned, I found him sitting on the couch, looking slightly out of place, his hands resting awkwardly on his knees. I settled down beside him, sinking into the plush cushions of the couch, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from his body. The fabric of my gown brushed lightly against his arm as our bodies touched, the contact sending a shiver up my spine. His breath hitched in his throat, a sudden intake of air that betrayed the tension he was trying so hard to conceal. I could see it in the way his shoulders stiffened, his eyes flickering nervously between me and the space in front of him, as though he couldn't decide where to look. He gave a small, nervous laugh, the sound almost swallowed up by the silence of the room. He shifted his weight, as if contemplating whether to move away or lean in closer, but he didn't budge. Instead, he stayed right where he was, the distance between us impossibly small. His gaze darted to mine, then away again, his uncertainty evident in the way his hands fidgeted on his lap. Are you always this shy? I teased, a playful smile curling at the edges of my lips. I let my hand drift to the cushion between us, resting there for a moment before slowly sliding down to his thigh. The fabric of his jeans was rough against my fingertips, a stark contrast to the silky texture of my gown. I could feel the firmness of his muscles beneath the denim, the way they tightened instinctively at my touch. His blush deepened, spreading from his cheeks down to his neck, the color blooming like a rose under the surface of his skin. His eyes widened ever so slightly, caught somewhere between surprise and the faintest hint of desire. There was a charge in the air now, a palpable tension that hung around us like a thick fog. I leaned in closer, letting my lips hover near his ear, my voice dropping to a whisper that barely broke the quiet. I want you inside of me. The words seemed to echo in the room, hanging between us with a weight that was almost suffocating. His eyes flew open wide, his breath coming out in a shaky exhale. For a moment, he looked as though he might say something, his mouth parting slightly in protest, but no words came out. His confusion was clear, his brows knitted together, the uncertainty in his eyes deepening, as if he were torn between his instincts and his better judgment. Before he could gather his thoughts, I closed the distance, pressing my lips to his. His mouth was soft, warm, and unyielding at first, the kiss tentative and unsure. I could feel the way he hesitated, his body still tense, as though he wasn't certain if he should reciprocate. His lips barely moved against mine, like he was testing the waters, unsure of how far he could let himself go. But as I deepened the kiss, I sensed the shift within him, a slow unraveling of the barriers he had built. I could feel his breath against my skin, hot and uneven, his hands twitching at his sides as though they longed to reach out but couldn't quite make the leap. I pressed closer, the silk of my gown sliding against his arm, and I could feel his heart beating rapidly, as though trying to match the rhythm of my own. His hesitation lingered, a mix of confusion and yearning in the way he kissed me back, like a man struggling against a current that was stronger than he expected. The kiss lingered, each moment stretching out as I urged him to surrender, to give in to the pull that had drawn us together in the first place. His hands finally found their way to my waist, a hesitant touch that sent a thrill racing through me. It was as though he had reached the edge of a cliff and, for the first time, was teetering on the brink, deciding whether to take the leap or pull back.